Good afternoon, Naumaan. Thanks for joining us today. And I think this is kind of a shared host podcast. We're here at the Knowledge Resolution Hub. I think we're the first podcast to be recorded in this, what I think is a really awesome space.
Very cool.
I'm really excited to be here. I'm excited for our conversation, but I guess we should introduce ourselves first. So maybe I'll introduce you first.
Thank you.
So Naumaan Hameed, one of the partners at Greenberg Hameed. I think you're actually one of the founders of the organisation.
Correct.
You're a specialist in immigration law. And the thing I'm most excited about for today is just the passion that you've got for not settling for the status quo and actually trying to challenge the system a little bit and try and improve and change what we're doing from an immigration perspective, and how do we actually interface that with the real world of the industry. So that's what I'm excited about. So
Thank you very much for the intro, and let me reciprocate. We've had some great discussions. Craig Woodall is an industry expert with over 25 years of experience. What he'll be bringing to the table is knowledge of the construction industry, renewables, infrastructure on one hand. The other part that excites me about Craig is he knows my world. He was an immigrant himself, so he's lived the experience. And the area he'll be talking about, which I think is fascinating, and he's got 20 years of experience in it, is leadership consulting strategy, which I think we need more than ever in terms of trying to fix some of the systemic problems. So I'm looking forward to engaging with you on today's discussion.
Excellent, thank you. So I guess the first thing we should discuss is, why are we here? We got invited to come and do this podcast to talk about immigration, and I know it spurred a couple of conversations between us, and we could talk for days on this topic. But for me personally, we hear about immigration in the news all the time. Social media, it's in the news, home and away. It's across the border. It's a global thing. We're seeing it in Europe. There's a lot of discussion. So I think for me, part of it is actually getting to the truth, because I never know quite what to believe. But I also want to dig in during the conversation today to some of the leadership challenges, because it's more just than what I call the rules and the tools. It's more than that. It's more than just the numbers. There's a human aspect to it for me. It's about awareness. It's about challenging ourselves. It's about increasing retention, but having adaptable and a workforce that's ready for change. So for me, that's where I would like the conversation to sort of weave into today. So what are you looking to get out of this conversation?
So look, when we look at this topic, and we've had good discussions beforehand, it's a little bit scary what we're walking into. Very significant challenges. But the part that excites me about talking this through with you is to really look through how we can rethink the issue. It's a complex issue, and I think it needs new thinking. And part of it is multifaceted. So I think I've always looked at immigration in the past pretty much in isolation with my clients. But I think in terms of dealing with the systemic issues, it's about bringing together different ideas and thinking about a better way to try to find a solution to a complex situation. Hopefully this charts a little bit of the beginnings of a path to start chipping away at it, a very complex and interesting issue.
Yeah, and I think chipping away is the right term, because if anybody's under the illusion out there that we're going to solve the problem today, there's a spoiler alert. I don't think we're actually going to solve it. I think we are starting the conversation.
Right.
And we're going to share some different perspectives, because we both come from different sides of this kind of conversation. But like you, I think it's a multifaceted, I think was the term you used. There's several aspects. To me, there's the social aspect, there's the economic aspect, there's the educational aspect. There's a number of drivers. You mentioned earlier, I'm an immigrant in Canada. I came over 24 years ago. I was very fortunate. I had a very privileged process to get here. I came from the UK. I was educated in England. I speak English. I look like this. I came over to a professional job on an intercompany transfer, and it was still difficult.
Right.
But when I think about it, the immigration part of it was easy. Getting the forms filled in, paying the fees, showing up at the airport and getting the permits for my family and myself and student visas. That thing was a formality I had to go through. But it was on day two that the challenge really started. It was, how did we actually fit in to this society? Now, again, I had a very easy approach compared to most, which is why I always say, from an immigration perspective, the respect I have for people that face way more challenges, that show up speaking a different language, not necessarily having the job opportunities that I had. The courage it takes to do that is a huge respect to individuals doing that. So to me, the process is more than just an immigration process. It's an entire life change. And I think what I call the human systems, but it's a complex process. And I think that's why when we were coming up with the title for this, we called it, the imperfect problem. But combining some leadership, self-awareness with the immigration practice, I think that is the potential solution to this imperfect kind of problem. But the engineer in me, I'm an engineer at heart, so
Right.
numbers and facts are important to me. So kind of, if what's the empirical truth out there? I get a lot of information sort of downloaded to me, and I read a lot and I see a lot. But what should I really be believing about the actual immigration challenge and the solutions at the moment?
Yeah, so I really like the way you framed it. It's a complex issue. Immigration is going through a tide of change at unprecedented proportions. And I think, when you talk about the problem we're dealing with, which is an imperfect problem, the irony here is we have massive shortages in construction and infrastructure projects, and we'll talk about that today. And you would think, intuitively, the solution would be immigration, that if you have shortages, you need more immigration, you bring people in. But it's a painful irony in the sense that the current immigration minister has created policies in order to reduce immigration. And this is both for permanent residents and temporary immigration. So to give you a little context, you're a numbers guy, you're an engineer. Historically, we've been looking at about inviting 500,000 immigrants a year, and that number has been going up quite regularly. We're looking at about 395,000 next year, going down to 365 in the next 2 years thereafter. So quite a significant decrease, although in critical areas like construction, infrastructure, healthcare, and tech, we have these chronic shortages, right? And so what's happened is, ironically, it's the housing issue which triggered this, which is that we've had over 2 million temporary foreign workers enter the country in the last couple of years. One could argue that maybe there was a lack of guardrails, and we had many people who may not have been selected precisely, but they came into the country. And then there was an observation with inflation and the cost of living that we don't have houses for them. But the irony is we need those same people in many of these areas in construction and trades to build the houses. Right? So that's one of the issues we have. We see that provincially the numbers have been decreased as well. So they have half the allotment. And what you would find in areas like construction, in smaller provinces, they rely on that provincial program because they might not be able to attract immigrants from the federal stream. That's been reduced. And then you'd find generally there's caps on the number of temporary foreign workers. So there's one issue of volume coming in and demand. The other issue, and we'll get into this a little bit more deeply, I don't think we're selecting and our systems are now modernized to the point that they need to. We're selecting individuals under our express entry system based on factors like age, education, Canadian work experience, but there's very particular skill sets, and it's very dynamic, as you would know, industry. Things are changing with tech all the time. Jobs are morphing, and I think we have to be able to select more precisely. So the short story, it's immigration's an imperfect solution. I'll let you get into the leadership piece shortly, but it's an imperfect solution because it should be the solution to the problem, but it's not working correctly at this time, and it will not have the capacity that it needs for this industry.
Yeah, excellent. And I think one of the things you allude to there is this, what I call a lag, which is, there has been, as a country, from Canada, there's been a lot of immigration over the years, as you alluded to, and it ramped up. Our infrastructure never caught up with that, right? From a healthcare perspective and roads and housing, it never caught up. And now we're going to almost close off that faucet a little bit and reduce the people coming in. So it's kind of this chicken and egg type situation. So I think there's the lag we need to take into account. And then, as you also talk about, it's how do we get the right people in the right places.
Right.
From my side, I'm less concerned how do we get the right people into the right places. I'm concerned with how do we get them to stay there.
Right.
How do we actually lead in a different way so that people actually don't do, and I know from conversations we've had before, you refer to it as the bounce back, I think. Maybe you can probably elaborate on that better than I can. What does the bounce back look like, and what actually is it?
Yeah, so let me give you a little context. So, bounce back is a concept where immigrants come into the country and at some point they decide they can't stay or they don't want to stay, right? And so, there's a report that I reviewed which is quite interesting. It covered the period of 1982 to 2017. Conference Board of Canada, in fact, studied this issue. And what they found was about 15 to 20% of immigrants end up leaving the country within 25 years. And specifically, of that 15 to 20%, you would find that almost 33% leave in the first 5 years. So they come, they check it out, and they go back. Right? And the analysis seems to suggest that some of the factors there that drive them to make that decision is, number one, ironically, you're going to hear it, housing, which is like a circular issue because we need these people to come in. And number two is just the cost of living generally and inflation. And this one's very interesting as part of where we have to go in terms of solutions. Many immigrants come in and they're not able to work in their desired occupation. There's too much bureaucracy. And they actually view that they would have a higher standard of living because it'd be much easier for them to just continue working in their occupation because of the credential issue. Right. So I think those are the factors that we call bounce back in terms of immigration. And so if you contextualize it, it's a little misleading. We're reducing our number of permanent residents every year, but we know that every period of time when we look back, we're losing about 20%. So we're reducing the numbers, and we're actually recognizing these people, many of them will not stay. And just to contextualize the shortage, there's an RBC report that says we need in Canada about 500,000 people in order to build the necessary houses by 2030, right? Now, against that, there's another report that says by 2028, 700,000 trades workers will retire. 700,000, right? And then we know that there's a third statistic, right? And it says that of the 4 million trade workers here, 25 will need to basically modernize their skills to prevent being obsolete. So if you think about those shortages in this industry against the bounce back, that makes the situation even more complex.
Yeah, that gap gets even
That's
bigger.
right.
We've been talking about baby boomers and the retirement and all the rest of it for years now. And what you're talking about, the numbers you're talking about, are just compounding that and making that situation kind of even worse. When you talk about the bounce back, for me, when I came over 24 years ago, we used to call it the cure. But the cure was different because there was it was a double bounce.
Right.
There used to be a thing where people would come to Canada 6 months in, they'd live through their first winter, and they'd go, "Oh man, I'm going home."
Yes.
So they would head back, and then they would realise that the grass wasn't greener, and they would actually come back. So within a year or two, they would come back and make a permanent sort of settle back here. But it sounds to me that isn't happening. People are coming here and then leaving and going back permanently, and it makes me think if everything else was equal, and I was coming to Canada today to do the job I did 24 years ago, earning what I earned, would I stay? And I'm not sure I would. I'm not sure I would have been able to provide the lifestyle which I was able to 24 years ago. It was a significant improvement in our lifestyle, but the economies have kind of switched around the world now. I'm not sure I'd be able to provide for my family in the way I could, and I would potentially be one of those bounce back statistics.
What's interesting there, Craig, is that when you look at that report, people that came probably at your time, they have a lower bounce back.
Right.
But it's the people that are coming more recently that are actually increasing that numerical number. So there's a trend that immigrants for multiple reasons they're coming to Canada and leaving. And so I'd be interested, so I'm talking about the immigration side, but what I'm very interested about is, and you talk about a human system, right?
Yeah.
And what are some of the factors that might be contributing to why talent is coming into these new environments and potentially not sticking around or performing well?
Yes, that's a great kind of segue into, and I should have maybe elaborated earlier about the human system. It's terminology I use all the time. We have this, we're great with policies and procedures. The Western world has got very efficient administratively and technically, and investing in tools and technology and rule books and policies and procedures. The area that we haven't invested in is this human system, which is everything else. It's our self-awareness, it's our egos, our biases that I'll dig into a bit. But it's that element which I think actually helps people stay, and it actually retains them, because there is a very human aspect to the immigration process. Having lived through it myself, I know the toll it will take on people and their families, and you can't fix that with a spreadsheet or an app. What you need to do is recognise there is a human impact to it. I also think we've got this from a workplace perspective. I think about hiring managers, and I think about the organisations and companies, whether it's out on a construction site, in an engineering office, at a bank or an insurance company. I think it's all the same, which is we've got this. We all have biases. I've got biases. I could write them on the wall for you. I've also got some unconscious biases that I know nothing about, and those biases don't help because people come in, they look different, they sound different, they've got different experience. And what do I hear time and time again is, well, you haven't got 10 years Canadian experience.
Right.
So how could we possibly put you into this position? Well, guess what? They've got some critical thinking experience. They've demonstrated just by the fact they're prepared to move themselves and their family around the world. They've got resilience that some sort of homegrown talent may not have. They've got adaptability. They've got an appetite for change. They've got skills that don't necessarily check the box from an immigration perspective. But if we tap into those things, I think that changes the workforce and makes us a more advanced and adaptable workforce. But at the end of the day, that's not in our human nature. Our human system is much more protective. One of the things I often talk about is we're a pack animal, humans. Right. At the end of the day, we're just animals. We like to think we're very logical, we're very rational, but at the end of the day, we're animals, and we're driven by fears, and we're driven by survival instincts. And as pack animals, we close ranks very quickly. One of the examples I always use is, remember back to when, or if you've got kids, when you put your kids in school, first day of JK, everybody's new, everybody shows up, and it's fearful for everybody, but very quickly, within weeks, days even, the pack starts to form, and you find some very close friendships there. Now, when you show up in grade 5, having moved from a different area, and you have to break into that pack, it is way more difficult because the pack circles, the silo is formed, the wall gets defensive, and it's much more difficult, and the fear is there. And I think that's very similar to the immigration process. When somebody arrives in the country, they then arrive in a new job. The pack is well established already. And I don't know that we do a very good job of recognizing that. And now some companies are doing a great job of it. Some companies are breaking down some of those barriers and going out of their way to do it. But I think leadership would benefit from recognizing that as a problem,
right,
and trying to be more innovative with it. I think if we can increase that self-awareness, acknowledge those biases exist, acknowledge that we've all got an ego, which means we want to think that our experience, our journey was the right way to get here, and anybody that didn't take our path potentially took the wrong path, so how could they possibly do what I did? It all feeds into the imposter syndrome and making ourselves feel valuable, and it's a survival thing. But if we can get past that and have people be okay being a little bit more uncomfortable, I think what we do is we create this culture of, I call it stickiness, where people want to stay. They want to belong. The pack gets bigger, the pack gets stronger. But that's not human instinct. Human instinct is close ranks. And I think if we can break that down a little bit and change that, it's going to help. Now,
fascinating. Yeah.
I could go on all day about this. This is something I'm passionate about. It's the reason I got out of the industry, to help the industry for the last 10 years with Bing. But one of the things I want to challenge you on is social media, because I know we have kind of different perspectives on this. So I want to challenge you a little bit on how does social media over the last 20 years, as that's become so sort of prevalent in our society, what impact is that having on the immigration process and sort of the adoption of people as they get here?
Right. It's interesting because I hear this from clients, prospective clients, and clients in the country all the time. So in the past, you would find, probably similar to your experience, you experienced Canada firsthand. You made your own conclusions based on your own experiences. With social media, the advantage, first of all, is the amount of information that a prospective immigrant gets to be well prepared in terms of understanding what's the experience from someone who's come from their own country, maybe in their own industry, understanding the credential issue, if you're a doctor, if you're a tradesperson. So you have a very clear understanding. You can manage your psychological adjustment. Maybe you can even do some of the groundwork from outside of the country. So those are all positive points. But what I've also noticed, particularly where there's been a link between the housing crisis and immigration, there's also been social media information that's been, to a certain extent, maybe somewhat sensationalized, where it's serving another purpose. And so some of the information, I think, to your point, which I find fascinating, an individual who's not an immigrant, who's new to a company, has certain roadblocks to get through. But an immigrant in today's day and age that walks in has to first understand all of the cultural dynamics they're walking into in the new world of work. But also, there's perceptions about immigrants often through social media that adds another layer of baggage that they have to overcome. So I think what I've seen recently has been a little troubling because a lot of it is not based on numbers but perceptions, and that's what worries me about it.
Right. It's funny, as you say that, it takes me back when I came over and I was signed up for the company soccer team. And I don't play soccer. But the presumption was, well, he's coming from England, he must be a soccer player.
Right.
But those were the simple presumptions I had to deal with, and there was no social media aspect to it. So I can only imagine what it's like now. I think when I came over, it was different. I didn't have the showreel kind of expectation. You know, I didn't know what to expect. I'll be perfectly honest with you. When I left England and came to Canada for the first time, never been across the Atlantic, came over to check it out. I didn't know how flat Ontario was, because all I'd ever seen was the books, which had the Rockies and the Mounties on horseback. So it was eye-opening for me, but it was eye-opening in a pleasant way. We were constantly surprised. You know, I'd never heard of Tim Hortons because it didn't travel around the world like it does now. So it's little Canadian experiences like that that meant a lot at the time, and they were pleasant experiences as we got to know the community and we got welcomed. And I think social media has changed that, because now people see like you say, the social feed, the sort of the highlight reel. So everybody assumes, everyone's got a cottage up on Lake Joe, and everyone's got this. So I think people are, in my experience, they are disappointed quicker potentially because their expectation was artificially high in the first place. I don't know if that makes sense, but I think we're setting people up for failure in that regard sometimes.
Yes.
So it definitely plays a part, but I think I definitely think it's different. So,
Right. You know, there are 2 points I wanted to make that you touched on that I think are very interesting, because this discussion is about, redefining a complex problem and its leadership in immigration. There's a lot of intersection in trying to solve the problem between the two domains. And you mentioned something about employers needing to be brave and to rethink what their expectations are about who they're hiring. It might be different than what we've thought in the past, right? Immigration, I believe, is a similar type of, needs a similar mindset, a human mindset, as you'd say. It's not the same people. It's not the same factors that we've historically looked at. To your point, you mentioned when a recruiter potentially acting for the company, they're looking for someone with 10 years of Canadian experience. Our immigration system is predicated on looking for someone with Canadian experience. They get more points than general experience outside of the country. But what about the quality of the experience? What about the relevance of the experience to the job? And you also talked about someone that has perseverance, right? And we were talking today about the bounce back, right? People are going to come in and they're going to have obstacles, social media obstacles, work, life, culture issues in a new country, credential issues, maybe not being fully recognized for the work that they've done when they get to Canada. But it's really important that they actually have that perseverance. And so part of the recruiting challenge, I think, is to look past the traditional markers of success, because we're in a situation where the jobs of tomorrow are not defined today. They're going to morph in real time, and it's going to put a lot of pressure and stress. And it's only those people that can persevere that are going to be able to, establish themselves well, and from an immigration perspective, stay in the country. And from your perspective, thrive, I imagine, and contribute in a very challenging landscape. So it's interesting to see how our worlds actually connect and why they have to connect to solve this type of problem.
Exactly. And I think when you say when we talk about the experience, the 10 years Canadian experience, one of my old colleagues, Jim, used to say all the time, you say, you can have 10 years experience or you can have 1 year's experience 10 times.
Right.
And the system doesn't recognize the difference between those things.
Absolutely right.
And I think the system doesn't also recognize what experience is, because it isn't technical. We can teach people technical things. But I think perspective, being open-minded, adaptable, resilient, as we talked about, those are things that if we start bringing those into the experience equation,
Right.
I think what we actually start doing is giving a little bit more credit to some people, which ultimately can change the industry and give us that experience that we actually need. Because the world's changing. I mean, it's not the same world as 20 years ago,
Right.
and that change is exponential. So the rate of change is so quick right now that I'm not sure that in 5 years or 10 years' time we really know what the challenge we're going to be facing is.
Right.
So we've got to be thinking on our feet, and we can't be constantly this lag kind of behind. So if I think about the global kind of thing, and we've had a pandemic, we'll talk about that soon because that impacted it, but this isn't a Canadian problem, right? I think we started at the beginning. This is a world where all countries are talking about immigration. It's all across Europe. It's certainly down south of the border right now. There's a lot of discussion around it. Everywhere else in the world is talking about it. Have you, in your experience, seen other countries doing a better job, a different job? What's the approaches out there that we could learn from?
Right. So I think there are different lessons to be learned, and right. So when we look at Australia, for example, they're ahead of us in testing out different approaches that I think we can learn from.
Right.
They have a similar issue. The numbers are shockingly similar. I think by 2030, they're going to have a shortage of 500,000 tradespeople in construction and infrastructure. The report suggests, just like in Canada, the costs are going up. The supply chain's being challenged. There's more overtime with a smaller number of workers having to really sort of grind through projects, not sustainable. The Australian government did create a program that did contemplate some of these needs. But what industry did is they jumped in and they've identified, and they've been fairly vocal about this fact, that there are, it's been a misstep, and there are 12 different occupations they've identified as a group together that need to be addressed. Otherwise, they will not be able to address this longer-term problem. They have the feeling that in the short term, at least, access to foreign talent is the most immediate solution. And so they've engaged directly with the government. They've dealt with local subgroups in terms of employment authorities and industries that test the standards of different jobs to have this active discussion, right? And so the feeling is that this will create a new pilot, and they're working hand in hand, which I like, because what I've found from my experience, the best programs are the programs where there's good consultation and there's industry leadership where they're sitting beside the officials and giving very detailed empirical information as to what is needed, why. What are the impacts if we don't fulfill this? And how do we identify the right job as opposed to a broad general occupation? What are the actual skills that are needed? And so I think that's one of the lessons I think we should keep our eye on Australia. And here, I think we can potentially, let's avoid the first misstep, but work. And one of the points from the minister, despite talking about reducing immigration, he has noted in particular construction and healthcare do need special consideration. Right. So the key, I believe, is for our thinking to get to the table with industry leaders to make sure they can make a good decision on how those programs are articulated.
So that collaborative approach that sounds like Australia are doing, and I'm sure it's not perfect, but they're making an effort there. Does that lead to a more targeted, lower numbers but more targeted and sort of focused immigration? So those individuals then, it's easier for them to join the industry. Is that how that's working?
So it's interesting you mentioned that, because the third piece of their proposal was also to try to lessen the credential bureaucracy.
Okay.
Right? So they're thinking holistically. How do we identify the individuals? Even though Australia has a similar issue, they're saying that we cannot accommodate as many immigrants and foreign workers because of the housing issue.
Yep.
Same story,
Yep.
right? But what they're doing is they're starting to figure out, okay, if we've got less numbers, how do we get the right people that we need critically?
Right.
And now each number is so important that you have to get the right skill set. It's an economic program. So you have to make some decisions about where do you prioritize and how do you pinpoint the right skill set. Otherwise, you bring the wrong person in, and to the credential point, if it's going to take them 2 years to be effective, then what have you accomplished?
Right.
And even though we've seen that, the growth rate in construction projects may be slightly down currently, it's often a product of not having the talent to be able to build. And you've raised a good point. That inventory need is there. It's pending. It's building, right?
Yeah.
So at some point, we have to get it right. So that's the part which is kind of scary, is that if we don't get it right, the problem's growing fast.
Yes. Yeah. It's going to get ahead of us.
That's right.
So what about Canada? I have to believe that we've done some stuff here that's working, whether it's small pilot projects, whether it's certain industries. What are the sort of the shining examples that you think we can learn from more locally?
You know, I always talk about one particular program that started roughly around 2016 in the tech industry. It's called the Global Talent Stream. It started as a pilot, which is often the right way, is test it, but test it with industry leaders. I was involved very closely in that particular initiative because a number of our large tech clients that had a lot of impact, they raised their voice. A paper was created with a number of smaller companies explaining how the system wasn't working, right? And explaining the impact to Canada. And that was in a traditional approach. And the idea was, if we are able to fast track certain types of workers in a measured way, the impact for Canada would be much better. And so we should create a special process. So in this particular program, they identified a number of occupations. And instead of having to recruit publicly and wait, the government said, we'll waive the recruitment for these occupations.
Right.
Or if someone's truly specialized and it's attested to by a certified referral party, we will waive that. But in exchange, what you will do, when those workers come in, you will then train Canadians in the very skills that we don't have today. You will make strategic investments into industry. You will ensure that you target increased revenue, so it increases the tax base. So it's basically a carrot where it says, we recognize you have a problem, bring them in, but then invest back.
Right.
And I would say, and this pilot turned into a permanent program, and it's probably the shining light of all of the programs I've seen in terms of its impact. So I would love to see a similar type of thinking potentially in the construction infrastructure arena, where they take those principles and apply them.
Right. It almost seems cliche to say it's a win-win, but it sounds like avoiding the bounce back. It sounds like there was a good intention in the whole program,
right,
that both sides got something out of that, and it wasn't just a bureaucratic check the box, fill the numbers kind of approach.
Well, and there's parallels, because at that time in tech, if you were looking for in-demand talent, it was very difficult to actually convince the individual to wait that long to come in and experience the delays and bureaucracy. So they fast-tracked the program for that reason.
Right.
Individuals came in, right, and that's been a game changer. Now, there's still this issue, though, of challenges, the bounce back issue, and many of these issues exacerbated around the pandemic. In fact, I'm remembering the statistic of bounce back was highest in 2020 during the pandemic.
Is that right?
Yeah. So we know that the world flipped upside down and thinking changed. Kind of curious about your side, like knowing how impactful that was. It still impacts immigration.
Yeah.
What's your view of the impact of the pandemic here in Canada on business?
It's interesting because I think as industry we're trying to convince ourselves we got past it, and it is history and it's in the past. I don't think we have yet. I think it had a number of impacts, as you said, immigration, that bounce back. I hadn't heard that, but that's an interesting statistic that it actually went up during that time. And I think partly that is just people trying to get back to there. As I said, it's getting back to what's safe and secure.
Right.
I think one of the things I've seen that's a lasting impact of it is the trust or lack thereof. Some industries suffered from it more than others. I think construction and healthcare, we've mentioned both of those a lot today already. I think those two industries more than any other that I work with. And I work with leaders across all sorts of industries. And I should have said at the beginning, when I talk about leadership, I'm not talking about C-suite. I'm not talking about managers. I'm talking about everybody. I mean, there's leadership in society. There's leadership at the sort of the lowest levels in organizations. It's how people conduct themselves. But what I've seen is this trust throughout organizations took a real hit after the pandemic. What made construction and healthcare particularly different was the separation that we saw. and the divide. Trust is very much you have to earn it. You don't. I can't just say you're going to trust me. We've met several times now. We start to build a relationship, and over a period of time, I could prove myself, and you would start to trust me more and more. I'm going to screw up occasionally because I'm human, and when I do that, if I've done enough positive trust type stuff, I mean, Stephen Covey talks about this in the sort of some of his books about the trust bank. If I've made enough positive deposits, I can mess up and take a withdrawal occasionally, and you will let me off with that. You'll forgive me because I've still got a positive, healthy trust balance. During the pandemic, we lost that ability in the traditional ways to build up that positive balance. We weren't bumping into people in the corridors. We weren't having the coffee kind of conversations. We weren't doing the meetings before and after where we built trust because, we got really good at doing meetings. And during the pandemic, we got exceptionally efficient at doing Zoom and Teams and different formats. And we got great for the hour doing the meeting. But you think back to those times, how often, and it's stuck till today, a meeting finishes at 11 and you end meeting and you start meeting.
Right.
And there's none of that social interaction. And that's where trust got built. Some companies have done a good job of finding other ways of achieving that trust building. But what I've observed in construction in particular, and healthcare, like I said, was during the pandemic, we didn't send everybody home. We sent some people home.
Right.
We sent administration home. Our clients stayed home. Consultants stayed home. All for good reasons at the time with the information we had. We then took a bunch of the industry and we sent them out to the front line. And we said, here's some PPE. Be safe, be careful, we don't know what this thing is yet. So we created some adversity and some unknown, and we created a smaller pack, and they really trusted each other because they were out there risking everything at the time. And I think what that formed was some really high trust in those groups of people. Healthcare was the exact same.
Right.
Healthcare administration, quite rightly, got out of the way and operated remotely whilst frontline workers did what they needed to do. What that created was a very high level of bond, if you like, and a trust there, which created this kind of silo. And what I'm now seeing is the gap between administration and frontline workers in healthcare, in construction. I'm sure there's other industries as well, but they're the two that I see the most. That divide is bigger than it's ever been. So now tie that back to immigration. Now you've got people coming to join the country in two industries that we've already alluded to, have that demand. So we're bringing people in. Now not only have they got to break into an industry that was always a challenge, now they've got to break into a silo within that industry where potentially there's been a breakdown of trust with another part of that industry. That's just making the problem worse and worse. So I think there is an amount of work to be done now, rebuilding trust within our teams, within our organizations. And it's not difficult, but it needs to be intentional.
What do you think, Craig? It sounds like a complex issue that's formed over this period of the pandemic where the very nature of the interaction has created a different relationship advantage, trust that you mentioned. How should a company, knowing that, for example, in construction, there's shortages and you're going to have to open your eyes to different people coming in new to the organization, what should they be thinking about on the strategic side?
You use the word strategy, and I love it. I work with a lot of clients and they have strategic plans. They never have a strategic plan around building trust, but they all admit it is foundational for their organizations, for their success. If you talk to any CEO, they're going to talk about trust, because if their supply chain doesn't trust them, if their clients don't trust them, if their employees don't trust them, they don't have a business. And then you look at their strategic plan for the next 5 years, and they talk about mergers and acquisitions and retention. They don't talk about trust. We leave it to chance. I think businesses need to be more strategic about trust. And like I say, it is not that difficult. It is about recognizing this human system. It's about recognizing that human connection is really, really important. Doesn't mean that we throw away the technology. I think the technology is here and we should be embracing it because I think it's great. I think the fact that we can share work around the world is awesome. And I think we can build those connections. But we're going to have to be intentional about how do we form the human connection using the technology we have. And it's going to go beyond just having meetings because we don't build the trust. So I've probably spent more time in the last 3 or 4 years doing what I call project partnering, bringing teams together for no other reason than just to get them in the room together and start talking about their human system. How are they connecting together? How are they collaborating? How are they not having the courage to say what they need to say when they need to say it. That's all about trust. And I think if we get more strategic about doing that kind of initiative and not just relying on the efficiency of getting the work done, then I think we can start breaking down some of those trust barriers, which leads in, as I alluded to earlier, that opens the door somewhat to bringing people in from different industries, from different geographies, from different societies. I think we can actually start embracing that instead of seeing it as a fear and a threat. Because what we did do during the pandemic, we created a heightened sense of fear.
Right.
And everybody went back to that sort of basic primal survival instinct. We've just got to get through the next 24 hours. And I think we've still got work to do. And we'd like to, thankfully, we're past it from a medical perspective primarily, but I think we've got, as society, I think we've got to rebuild some bridges there. And I think that's going to take some time.
One comment you made, and I was fortunate to sit in one of your sessions where you were talking about these issues, is the idea of it being intentional. Right? It's something you have to think about and proactively almost schedule to change your behavior, to ensure you appreciate that this has to be an action you take. And I'm thinking about many of my clients and the prospective immigrants that come in. And I would think, in addition to the general intentional considerations you need to provide for your workforce, there might need to be particular sensitivity about a new immigrant coming into a company. And again, special efforts to think what their experience is and be in their shoes.
Exactly. And I think I remember the session that you're alluding to there, and I think I probably challenged you all to take a couple of minutes to do something important.
Right.
Because my whole thing is we get so busy every day with urgent stuff that makes noise, right? And I know, I'm sure your world is just like mine. You come in the morning and you've got 10 hours worth of stuff ringing, pinging, knocking and shouting. The phone, the text, the technology we've got is awesome, but it gives everything an urgency. And the more noise it makes, the more likely we are to respond to it and finally get it done. And we fill our days with urgent stuff, which means we don't prioritize the important things, which is, I think I've had you do a gratitude moment, just stepping back for 120 seconds.
Yes.
Just to sit back for 2 minutes and check in with somebody, send somebody a note. That was a trust exercise as well, because what you're doing is saying, I see you, I recognize you, there's a human behind this screen, and you care to me, I care about you, there's some empathy. What you end up doing, that's a deposit in the trust bank.
That's right.
And all it took was 2 minutes. And I don't think your day got any more frantic or hectic because I forced you to stop for 120 seconds.
No. And in fact, I got immediate responses from the recipient.
Right.
Where you saw the power of taking that 90 seconds. Immediately, the person valued it. And so, again, intentional. That's really important.
That's it. You've got to prioritize it. If you don't make that important moment urgent, you're going to have to make it make noise, because the noisy stuff will always take priority. And the way that ties into immigration, imagine you've just arrived in the country and somebody's gone out of their way to take 2 minutes to check in, to ask how the weekend was, to offer some support. I think those are the little things we can do. And they're not difficult. They don't cost a lot of money, but they need intention and they need to be strategic, and we need everybody to start doing them. And if we do, it becomes infectious, and I think that is going to be a little bit more embracing. And it allows us to, I think, again, there's no one-stop solution, but it just helps prevent that bounce back that we talked about
100%,
a little bit. That's kind of my hope. I know from conversation, we've sat in these chairs last week sort of thinking about this podcast, and I think we sat here for 3 hours just backwards and forwards. I know we could talk all day, but we don't want to bore everyone with all of that. But just to kind of wrap it up, what do you think? We've talked about a lot of the problem. We've talked about the challenges. What do you think, if you had the magic wand, what's the next step? What can we do to actually have an impact and make a difference? Recognizing we can't fix everything, but what would you want to see the next step be?
I think the first part is awareness that comes from industry up to government. So very specifically, what are the articulated pain points, and creating that dialogue. Just like today we're having the first dialogue to chart the path, we need to have that dialogue to talk about these particular issues and what might be the solutions in terms of not just occupation, but what are the actual skills that we need. And perhaps it's a pilot, like we've discussed, with a think tank of people working on that solution, looking at other international countries, what's worked, what hasn't worked, that's analogous, and starting to test that.
Right.
That's number one. Number two, The selection criteria, I think we really have to think if we're going to have reduced numbers for a period of time, then we've got to pick correctly. So I think we've got to modernize the way that we're selecting potential immigrants.
Yeah.
And the third piece is what we're touching about, which is the resettlement of individuals that do come to the country. How do we make sure we kick it off the right way, that we're empathetic, that we understand their circumstances, support them in the workforce, but also in terms of making sure that if it's a credential issue, let's lessen some of that paperwork if we can. We have to protect the industry, absolutely,
Yep.
but there's got to be a better way to be creative about it. And then the fourth piece, which is really about the employer side, is when we're recruiting, right? I do believe, and you've touched on it too, people say you hire on the hard skills and you fire on the soft skills. I think really understanding the behavioral elements of success and thinking differently about how you recruit, first as an employer, as a recruiting agent. Eventually, immigration, I think, will have to modernize and start looking underneath because this bounce back, provinces have it so difficult. I'm from Manitoba, right? Manitoba, Saskatchewan, the Maritimes. Even in the best of circumstances, people come and they end up in Ontario and BC. So we have to figure out and crack that formula better as to what motivates someone to come, perform, and stay.
Yeah.
So I think that's from my perspective. And I love bringing in this leadership because the bounce back, this is where your world and my world cross over, is really creating that environment to stick.
Yeah. And like I think we started, this is, it's the perfect combination, right? It's this imperfect problem that we can't quite get our hands around, but there's more than one facet to it. And if we just try and fix it with immigration, it's not going to do it.
Correct.
It's going to involve a bigger kind of thing. And I think if we do it right, I think as an industry, if I just talk about the industry that I spent most of my career in, 25 years in, sort of engineering and construction, I think the industry historically has done what it's done in the past. When we keep repeating, we make the same mistakes, but we move forward and there's some opportunities. I think if we get the immigration process right and we get the right people and we bring in that different perspective, I think for me it's about change. It's about appetite for change. I love change. Not many people do. I really enjoy change, but I've realised over the last 10 years that's not normal. A lot of people aren't as keen on change. But I think if we can start bringing in different perspectives and being more open to it, I think the opportunities are endless for the industry. I think about my time back in England 25 years ago, prefabrication, modularisation. We'd been doing that for years. It was just a given. I came to Canada, we weren't doing it. I looked at some stats recently. Europe is already 2 times, sort of a factor of 2x ahead in terms of their adoption of that technology.
Right.
Now there's some driving factors. If you've ever been downtown in London, UK, there's really good reasons why you want to modularise and prefab because it's tough. In the same way that you go to Manhattan, they're doing it. But we haven't adopted it as in North America as we could do. But I think bringing in alternative perspectives help that. We've got AI, we've got robotics. There is stuff on the horizon that makes us uncomfortable, challenges our norms, challenges what we've always done. And I think if we can bring in the right mindsets, it can help us open our minds a little bit, change our perspectives, and we can actually start embracing this new age that is coming. We can't stop. We can resist, but we can't stop it. I think if we can start embracing it, I think it allows the industry to improve. So it's more than just kind of bums in seats kind of thing. It's not just about the numbers. It's actually about taking the industry to the next level, and I think it's just a piece of that. Piece of that problem.
And I would agree with that because if you look at the numbers game, because of the people exiting the labor market from retirement or bounce back, you can't solve the problem solely by numbers. It's going to have to be innovation. Even the housing issue itself, prefabricated houses might be part of the solution to get houses up fast at an affordable rate. So I'm with you. This is a multifaceted group exercise of bringing the right people together and attacking it holistically.
Yeah.
Right? And for too long, it's been a siloed solution and the groups are not working together. So hopefully, maybe this is the beginning of bringing more of these discussions and getting people to think that way.
It's interesting you mentioned housing. I think from a construction perspective, the housing market is one that really has embraced, modularisation, prefabrication.
Right.
But I think it's driven by need.
Yeah.
What we've got to do is create that need in other parts of the industry. and do the same thing. So if we're talking about innovation, it seems strange for me to ask, innovation in immigration. What is there anything that's been done differently? Anything that you're aware of that's changing the way that we're doing that from an innovation perspective that we need to get on board with?
Well, I think we're seeing an openness to immigration embracing AI.
Okay.
Now, the way they're doing it, I don't know if I fully agree with, which is when they're triaging decisions now, they're looking at algorithms that identify higher risk cases from lower risk to try to ensure that they can keep up with their processing speed.
Right.
Now, the point there is that's positive is openness to AI. What I would love to see in the selection criteria is eventually deepening the selection factors beyond just the obvious hard skills, but really looking at some of those softer skills or predicting. And this might sound a little out there, right? Especially when you talk about government. There are ways and there is experimentation to predict success factors.
Right.
So perhaps if for Canada to really compete internationally, we know we have a brain drain issue that works against us. We know we've got some higher costs in housing. But how do we select people that there's a higher predictability of them being able to come in, make an impact, and be sticky? And it might be looking at their talent DNA in addition to what employers need. Right. And so I'm very interested in that area, and I'd love to see immigration. I think globally there's going to be a real desire for every country to try to figure out how do we differentiate and get that talent that's so coveted. So I think that's where we need to go, and I'm hoping this is the beginning of using it in the right way.
Right, and I know at Greenberg Hameed you're kind of pushing. You're at the sort of the cutting edge of that, right? You're developing some tools to hopefully make that more real.
Correct.
Is that right?
Yeah, we've been working with Queen's University, looking at psychometric evidence and evaluations to then help primarily employers, be more open and reduce the bias, but understand who is more predictable if you're looking at foreign talent pools to come in and make a difference based on information that is related to that position. Yeah. It could be risk tolerance or stickiness. So, yeah, it's fun, keeps us, like you said, I like change, I like innovation, keeps us fresh and thinking differently, and hopefully the two worlds collide with, the government policy and then the private practice coming together and delivering solutions.
That's awesome. It reminds me, I was with a CFO last week. I do a lot of one-on-one kind of executive coaching. I was with a CFO and we were chatting probably an hour and a half. We didn't want to talk about spreadsheets, balance sheets, P&L. We talked about the human stuff, the psychology. Right. We talked about what they're motivated by, demotivated by. So if we can now bring those factors in, that's what really actually helps people stick. So
absolutely.
Yeah, I love it. I know we could go on all day, so we'll cut this off. But thanks, Naumaan, for joining us today, and I enjoyed the discussion. I know we're going to have plenty more discussions. To the Knowledge Resolution Hub, thank you for giving us this opportunity and giving us this space today. You've created something that I think is going to foster this kind of collaboration and this sort of creative thinking. So I'm excited for the future discussion.
And thank you, Craig. I've really enjoyed these engagements that we've had, even leading up. Lots of interesting areas, and I'm hoping that maybe this is the beginning of a pathway and we can continue to participate. And if people have questions about what we've spoken about, I'm sure we'd both be more than happy to talk further about what these solutions can look like.
Exactly. I think if we've proved nothing else today, we both enjoyed talking. So,
exactly.
Yes, no, we look forward to it. So thank you again, and we'll look forward to the future conversations.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay.